Lieutenant Sarah Chun had learned long ago that the element of surprise was her greatest weapon. Not the kind of surprise that came from explosive devices or tactical maneuvers, though she was expertly trained in both. The surprise came from being completely underestimated by everyone around her. Standing barely 5 feet 4 inches tall with a slight build that most people would describe as delicate, Sarah moved through the world with an almost invisible presence. Her black hair was always pulled back in a regulation bun, and her dark eyes held a calmness that some mistook for passivity. Those who knew her real story understood that this calmness was actually the mark of someone who had been tested in ways most people could never imagine. Fort Braxton was like any other military installation where multiple branches of service worked together on joint operations. The massive base housed everything from Army infantry units to Air Force logistics specialists, and it was here that Sarah had been assigned for what her superiors called a routine liaison position. What they didn't tell the other personnel was that Lieutenant Chun wasn't just any Navy officer. She was one of only 12 women who had successfully completed the Navy SEAL training program, a fact that was kept classified for operational security reasons. The morning that would change everything started like any other. Sarah arrived at the communications building at 0600 hours sharp, carrying her standard-issue laptop bag and a coffee from the base cafeteria. The hallways were already buzzing with activity as various units prepared for the day's training exercises and administrative duties. Her assignment was straightforward on paper. She was to serve as a liaison between the Navy Special Operations Command and the Joint Task Force being assembled at Fort Braxton. What this really meant was that she spent most of her days in briefing rooms, listening to Army and Air Force officers plan missions while she provided insight based on her extensive experience in unconventional warfare. The problem was that nobody knew about her experience. Her personnel file listed her as a communications specialist with a college degree in computer science. It made no mention of her 2 tours in Afghanistan, her expertise in close-quarters combat, or the fact that she could disassemble and reassemble 17 different types of firearms while blindfolded. This anonymity was by design. Female SEAL operators were still a sensitive topic within the military hierarchy, and Sarah's commanders had decided that she would be more effective if her true credentials remained need-to-know. Unfortunately, this meant that she was often treated as just another desk officer by personnel who had no idea what she was actually capable of. The first sign of trouble came during a morning briefing in Conference Room C. Sarah was reviewing satellite imagery with a group of Army Rangers when Sergeant First Class Marcus Rodriguez made an offhand comment that made her jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. "Maybe we should let the Navy girl handle the communications while the real soldiers plan the actual mission," Rodriguez said with a smirk that several other soldiers in the room found amusing. Sarah didn't respond immediately. She had heard comments like this hundreds of times throughout her career, and her training had taught her to pick her battles carefully. Rodriguez was a decorated soldier with multiple combat deployments, but he was also known for his arrogance and his particular disdain for what he called support personnel. Instead of rising to the bait, Sarah simply continued her analysis of the imagery, pointing out potential landing zones and escape routes with a precision that impressed even the most experienced rangers in the room. Her knowledge of terrain assessment and tactical planning was clearly beyond what anyone expected from a communications officer, but Rodriguez seemed determined not to notice. Over the next several weeks, the situation gradually escalated. Rodriguez began making increasingly pointed comments about Sarah's presence in operational briefings. He questioned her recommendations during planning sessions and made jokes about the Navy sending their diversity hire to play soldier with the real warriors. What Rodriguez didn't understand was that every dismissive comment and condescending smile was being carefully cataloged by someone who had been trained to identify threats and respond with overwhelming force when necessary. Sarah's calm exterior never wavered, but those who knew how to read the signs might have noticed the slight tightening around her eyes when Rodriguez spoke, or the way her hands remained perfectly still even when she was being openly disrespected. The other personnel on the base began to take sides without really understanding what they were choosing between. Some of the younger soldiers found Rodriguez's behavior inappropriate and started making efforts to include Sarah more actively in their discussions. Others, particularly those who looked up to Rodriguez's combat record, began treating Sarah with the same dismissive attitude their sergeant displayed. Sarah's roommate, Lieutenant Maria Santos from the Air Force, was one of the few people who sensed that there was more to Sarah than met the eye. During their late-night conversations in their shared quarters, Maria would sometimes catch glimpses of a harder edge beneath Sarah's professional demeanor. "You know you don't have to take his garbage, right?" Maria said one evening after Rodriguez had been particularly obnoxious during a joint training exercise. "There are channels you can go through if someone's creating a hostile work environment." Sarah was sitting at her desk, cleaning her personal sidearm with the kind of methodical precision that most people associated with obsessive-compulsive behavior. In reality, it was just how she had been trained to maintain her equipment, with an attention to detail that could mean the difference between life and death in a combat situation. "Some battles aren't worth fighting," Sarah replied without looking up from her work. "And some people aren't worth the energy." Maria watched her roommate work, noting the fluid efficiency of her movements and the way she handled the weapon like it was an extension of her own body. "You're not really a communication specialist, are you?" Sarah paused for just a moment before continuing her cleaning routine. "My job is to facilitate communication between different units. Everything else is just paperwork." It was a non-answer, but Maria had been around the military long enough to recognize when someone was operating under classification restrictions. She didn't push for more details, but she filed away her observations for future reference. The tension between Sarah and Rodriguez continued to build over the following weeks. Their interactions became a kind of performance art, with Rodriguez playing the role of the gruff, experienced soldier who had no patience for political correctness, while Sarah maintained her role as the quiet professional who absorbed insults without retaliation. What made the situation particularly volatile was that Rodriguez's behavior was beginning to affect the effectiveness of the Joint Task Force. Other personnel were starting to feel uncomfortable with the obvious hostility, and some of the younger soldiers were beginning to emulate Rodriguez's disrespectful attitude toward female personnel in general. Major Patricia Williams, the Army officer in charge of the Joint Task Force, called Sarah into her office on a Thursday morning in late September. Major Williams was a career soldier with 22 years of service, and she had a reputation for being fair but demanding. "Lieutenant Shun, I need to ask you about the situation with Sergeant Rodriguez," Major Williams said, gesturing for Sarah to take a seat across from her desk. "Several people have mentioned that there's been some tension between you two." Sarah sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap, and her expression neutral. "Sergeant Rodriguez has made his opinions about my presence here quite clear, ma'am. I don't believe it's affecting my ability to perform my duties." "That's not what I asked," Major Williams said, studying Sarah's face carefully. "I asked about the tension, and, frankly, I'm starting to wonder if there's more to this story than anyone's telling me." "I'm not sure what you mean, ma'am." Major Williams leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen against her desk blotter. "I've been in the Army for more than 2 decades, Lieutenant. I've seen a lot of different types of soldiers, and I've learned to recognize certain patterns. You carry yourself like someone with combat experience, you know tactical procedures better than most of my Rangers, and you have a security clearance that's higher than what a communication specialist would typically need." Sarah remained silent, waiting to see where the conversation was headed. "I'm not asking you to violate any classification restrictions," Major Williams continued. "But I need to know if Sergeant Rodriguez is creating a situation that could compromise operational security or unit cohesion. Because if he is, I need to address it before it becomes a bigger problem." "Sergeant Rodriguez is a good soldier, ma'am. His attitude toward me is his business. I can handle myself." Major Williams studied Sarah for a long moment, noting the quiet confidence in her voice and the way she seemed completely unbothered by the prospect of conflict. "I'm sure you can, Lieutenant. That's what worries me." The conversation ended without resolution, but it marked a turning point in the dynamic at Fort Braxton. Major Williams began paying closer attention to the interactions between Sarah and Rodriguez, and she started asking subtle questions about Sarah's background through official channels. Meanwhile, Rodriguez seemed to interpret Sarah's continued silence as weakness rather than restraint. His comments became more frequent and more pointed, and He began encouraging other soldiers to join in what he called keeping the Navy in line. The breaking point was approaching, though nobody realized it yet. Sarah continued her daily routine of briefings and administrative work, maintaining her professional demeanor even as the situation around her grew more toxic. She was like a coiled spring, storing energy and waiting for the right moment to release it. Those who knew her real background would have recognized the signs. The way she started arriving at the dining hall slightly earlier each morning, giving herself more time to assess the room and identify potential threats. The way her conversations became even more economical, conserving energy for more important uses. The way she began carrying herself with just a fraction more alertness, like a predator that had caught the scent of prey. But, to everyone at Fort Braxton, she was still just Lieutenant Sarah Chun, the quiet Navy communications specialist who didn't fight back when Sergeant Rodriguez pushed her around. They had no idea that they were about to witness what happened when someone finally pushed a Navy SEAL too far. The stage was set for a confrontation that would become legendary within military circles, a moment when assumptions would be shattered and reputations would be redefined. All it would take was one more provocation, one final insult that crossed a line that even Sarah's considerable self-control couldn't ignore. That moment was coming soon, and when it arrived, 500 witnesses would learn the difference between someone who couldn't fight back and someone who chose not to fight back. The lesson would be brief, brutal, and unforgettable. The October morning that would change everything started with what seemed like a routine training exercise. Fort Braxton was hosting a joint readiness evaluation, which meant that personnel from all branches of service would be demonstrating their capabilities for a team of Pentagon evaluators who had arrived the previous week. Sarah had been assigned to coordinate communications between the various units participating in the exercise, a role that required her to move between different command posts and ensure that information flowed smoothly between Army, Navy, and Air Force personnel. It was exactly the kind of assignment that her cover story as a communications specialist was designed to support. The main dining facility was busier than usual that morning, filled with soldiers grabbing quick breakfasts before reporting to their assigned positions for the day's activities. The room hummed with conversation about the upcoming evaluation, and there was a general atmosphere of nervous energy as everyone wanted to make a good impression on the visiting Pentagon officials. Sarah entered the dining hall at 0630 hours, carrying her standard tray and moving through the serving line with the same efficient movements she used for everything else. She selected her usual breakfast of scrambled eggs, wheat toast, and black coffee, then scanned the room for an available seat. The layout of the dining hall was something she had memorized within her first week at Fort Braxton. 6 long rows of tables that could each seat 12 people, with additional smaller tables near the windows for officers who preferred more private conversations. Emergency exits at the north and south ends of the building, with the main entrance facing west toward the parade grounds. Her preferred seating position was at the end of the 3rd row, where she could keep her back to the wall while maintaining a clear view of both the main entrance and the most direct route to the nearest exit. It wasn't paranoia, it was simply how she had been trained to think. Situational awareness was a habit that had kept her alive in places where the wrong choice of seating could have fatal consequences. This particular morning, her usual spot was occupied by a group of Air Force logistics personnel who were deep in discussion about equipment manifests. Sarah adjusted her route and headed toward a smaller table near the windows, where she could eat alone while reviewing her notes for the day's communications protocol. She had just sat down and opened her folder when Sergeant Rodriguez's voice cut across the ambient noise of the dining hall like a rusty knife. "Hey, Navy girl, you sitting all alone because your imaginary friends couldn't make it to breakfast?" The comment was loud enough to carry across several tables, and Sarah could feel heads turning in her direction. Rodriguez was sitting with his usual group of followers, a collection of soldiers who had adopted his attitude toward anyone they considered beneath their notice. Sarah didn't look up from her folder. She had learned long ago that acknowledging Rodriguez's provocations only encouraged him to escalate. Instead, she continued reviewing her communication frequencies and call signs, maintaining the same calm focus that had carried her through countless high-stress situations. I'm talking to you, Lieutenant, Rodriguez called out, emphasizing her rank with obvious mockery. Didn't they teach you Navy types to respond when a superior addresses you? This drew a few chuckles from Rodriguez's table, though several other soldiers in the dining hall looked uncomfortable with the public nature of the confrontation. Military etiquette generally discouraged this kind of open disrespect, especially between different branches of service. Staff Sergeant Jennifer Murphy, who was sitting at a nearby table with several other female soldiers, stood up and moved toward Rodriguez's table. Murphy was an Army military police officer with 15 years of service, and she had a reputation for not tolerating harassment of any kind. Sergeant Rodriguez, Murphy said in a voice that carried clear authority, perhaps you should focus on your own breakfast instead of bothering Lieutenant Shun. Rodriguez looked up at Murphy with an expression that mixed annoyance with calculation. Murphy outranked him and had the backing of the military police, but she was also a woman, which created a complicated dynamic that Rodriguez had to navigate carefully. Just trying to be friendly to our Navy liaison, Rodriguez said with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, making sure she feels welcome here among the real soldiers. I'm sure Lieutenant Shun appreciates your concern, Murphy replied dryly, but she seems perfectly capable of taking care of herself. Sarah finally looked up from her folder, making brief eye contact with Murphy and giving her a slight nod of acknowledgement. It was a gesture of thanks, but also a subtle signal that she didn't need assistance. Murphy seemed to understand the message and returned to her table, though she continued to keep an eye on the situation. Rodriguez interpreted Sarah's continued silence as weakness rather than control. Over the next 10 minutes, he made a series of increasingly inappropriate comments about Navy personnel in general and female soldiers in particular. His audience of followers laughed at his jokes and added their own commentary, creating an atmosphere that was becoming more toxic by the minute. I heard the Navy's so desperate for bodies that they're taking anybody now, Rodriguez said between bites of his pancakes. Pretty soon they'll be recruiting from elementary schools and nursing homes. Maybe that's why they sent us Lieutenant Shun, added Private First Class Danny Morrison, one of Rodriguez's most eager followers. She's probably still in high school, but they needed to fill their diversity quota. The comment was so far over the line that even some of Rodriguez's usual supporters looked uncomfortable. Sarah was clearly in her late 20s, with the kind of bearing that suggested significant life experience. The suggestion that she was underage was both factually ridiculous and professionally insulting. Sarah closed her folder and placed her hands flat on the table, a gesture that looked casual but actually represented a shift into a more alert posture. Her breathing remained steady and controlled, but those who knew how to read body language might have noticed the slight change in her muscle tension. Lieutenant Maria Santos, Sarah's roommate, entered the dining hall just as the situation was reaching a new level of toxicity. She immediately spotted Sarah sitting alone at her table, while Rodriguez's group continued their harassment campaign from across the room. Maria had grown up with 3 older brothers who were all military, and she understood the dynamics of masculine posturing better than most female officers. She could see that Rodriguez was building towards something bigger than his usual petty comments, and she was worried about what would happen when he finally crossed a line that even Sarah couldn't ignore. She grabbed a cup of coffee and approached Sarah's table, sitting down without asking permission. "Morning, Rumi. How's the prep for today's communications exercise going?" Sarah glanced at Maria and understood immediately that her friend was trying to defuse the situation by providing social support. It was a kind gesture, but Sarah knew that involving Maria would only give Rodriguez more targets for his hostility. "It's going fine," Sarah replied in her usual calm tone. "Just reviewing the frequency assignments and making sure all units can reach the command post when needed." "Sounds like typical hurry-up-and-wait military efficiency," Maria said, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "At least you get to work with actual communication equipment instead of sitting through another PowerPoint presentation about proper uniform regulations." The comment was designed to shift the conversation towards safe, boring topics that wouldn't provide Rodriguez with ammunition for further harassment. It was a smart tactical move, and under normal circumstances it might have worked. Unfortunately, Rodriguez had already committed to his course of action for the morning. He had built up an audience of supporters, established his dominance over the social dynamic in the dining hall, and painted himself into a corner where backing down would represent a loss of face in front of his peers. "Hey, Santos," Rodriguez called out. "You might want to find a different table. Your friend there might be contagious. I hear they don't have the same hygiene standards in the Navy that we maintain in the real military." Maria's jaw tightened visibly. As an Air Force officer, she was used to good-natured rivalry between the services, but Rodriguez's comments had long since crossed the line from teasing into genuine hostility. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Maria said, standing up and turning to face him directly, "I think you've said enough for one morning. Maybe it's time to focus on your own preparations for today's exercise instead of bothering other personnel." Rodriguez also stood up, and the dining hall suddenly became much quieter as people sensed that the situation was escalating beyond verbal sparring. Rodriguez was a big man, standing well over 6 feet tall, with the kind of muscular build that came from years of military physical training combined with natural genetic advantages. "Lieutenant Santos," Rodriguez said, emphasizing Maria's rank with the same mocking tone he had used with Sarah, "I don't believe anyone asked for your opinion about my conversation with Lieutenant Chun. Perhaps you should mind your own business and let the grown-ups handle military matters." The insult was directed at Maria, but it was clearly intended to provoke Sarah into responding. Rodriguez had calculated that attacking her friend would force Sarah to abandon her passive stance and engage in the kind of confrontation that he was confident he could win. Sarah stood up slowly, her movements controlled and deliberate. She was still shorter than both Rodriguez, and Maria still appeared physically unremarkable compared to the other soldiers in the dining hall, but something in her bearing had changed in a way that was difficult to define. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said in a voice that was quiet but carried clearly across the now silent dining hall, "Lieutenant Santos was just being polite. But since you seem to have something you want to say to me specifically, perhaps you should just say it directly." Rodriguez smiled, recognizing that he had finally succeeded in drawing Sarah into the confrontation he had been building toward for weeks. The dining hall was full of witnesses, including several of the Pentagon evaluators who had been eating breakfast at the officers' table near the windows. "What I want to say, Lieutenant," Rodriguez replied, taking a step closer to Sarah's table, "is that I'm tired of pretending that the Navy sent us a real soldier instead of some diversity hire who's never seen actual combat. This is a military installation, not a college campus, and some of us have actually earned our right to be here." The accusation hung in the air like smoke from explosion. Rodriguez had essentially accused Sarah of being an unqualified affirmative action placement, a charge that struck at the heart of every professional accomplishment she had earned through years of grueling training and dangerous deployments. Sarah remained motionless for several long seconds, her dark eyes fixed on Rodriguez's face with an intensity that made several nearby soldiers unconsciously take a step backward. When she finally spoke, her voice was so calm that it seemed almost conversational. "You think I haven't earned my place here, Sergeant? I think the Navy sent us a communications clerk and try to pretend she's qualified to plan military operations with soldiers who've actually been shot at," Rodriguez replied, encouraged by what he interpreted as Sarah's continued passivity. "And you think your combat experience makes you qualified to judge my background? Lady, I've done 3 tours in Afghanistan and 1 in Iraq. I've been in more firefights than you've probably seen in movies. So yeah, I think I'm qualified to recognize when someone's playing dress-up soldier." Sarah nodded slowly, as if considering his words carefully. Around the dining hall, personnel from all 3 services were watching the confrontation with a mixture of fascination and discomfort. This was the kind of inter-service rivalry that usually stayed within acceptable boundaries, but Rodriguez had pushed it into territory that felt genuinely dangerous. Major Patricia Williams had entered the dining hall during the exchange and was now standing near the serving line, evaluating whether she needed to intervene before the situation escalated further. She had been asking questions about Sarah's background through official channels, but the responses she had received were heavily redacted and raised more questions than they answered. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Sarah said finally, her voice still maintaining that eerie calm that was beginning to make people nervous I appreciate you sharing your opinion about my qualifications. But I think you might be operating under some misconceptions about my background. Oh, really? And what misconceptions would those be? Sarah glanced around the dining hall, taking note of the crowd that had gathered and the various exit routes available to her. Her situational awareness training was operating at full capacity now, automatically cataloging potential threats and escape options even though she was nowhere near a combat zone. You assume that because my personnel file lists me as a communications specialist, that's all I am, Sarah said. You assume that because I haven't responded to your provocation until now, that I'm not capable of responding. And you assume that because I'm a woman, I must be less qualified than the men around me. Rodriguez laughed, a harsh sound that carried no humor. Lady, I don't assume anything. I know that communication specialists don't get the same training as combat soldiers, and I know that the Navy standards are lower than the Army's. Those aren't assumptions, those are facts. Are they? Sarah asked, and there was something in her tone that made Major Williams start moving closer to their position. Tell me, Sergeant, what do you know about Navy SEAL training? The question seemed to come from nowhere, and Rodriguez looked confused for a moment before regaining his aggressive posture. I know it's supposed to be tough, but it's still Navy. Different world from real ground combat. Different, yes, Sarah agreed. More difficult in some ways. The attrition rate for SEAL training is about 80%. Most people who start the program never finish it. What's your point, Lieutenant? Sarah's smile was small and contained no warmth whatsoever. My point, Sergeant Rodriguez, is that you're about to learn the difference between someone who can't fight back and someone who chooses not to fight back. The words were spoken quietly, almost conversationally, but they carried an unmistakable promise of violence that made the hair on the back of several people's necks stand up. Major Williams quickened her pace toward their position, sensing that the situation was about to cross a line that couldn't be uncrossed. But Rodriguez, either too angry or too stubborn to recognize the warning signs, chose that moment to make the mistake that would define the rest of his military career. Is that some kind of threat, Navy girl? He snarled, taking another step closer to Sarah and raising his hand in what could have been interpreted as either a pointing gesture or the beginning of a physical attack. Because if you think you can intimidate me with your tough talk, you're about to learn what happens when you mess with a real soldier. The motion of his raised hand was all the justification Sarah needed. In the complex calculus of military rules of engagement, Rodriguez had just crossed the line from verbal harassment into potential physical assault. And Sarah Chun, whose real job was neutralizing threats to national security, had just been given permission to respond accordingly. What happened next would be over in less than 3 seconds. But those 3 seconds would be replayed and analyzed for years to come by everyone who witnessed them. Time seemed to slow down in the way it does during moments of extreme violence or clarity. 500 military personnel in the Fort Braxton dining hall were about to witness something that would challenge everything they thought they knew about combat, training, and the quiet lieutenant who had been absorbing harassment for weeks without retaliation. Sarah Chun had spent 8 years training her body and mind to respond to threats with maximum efficiency and minimum waste. When Sergeant Rodriguez raised his hand toward her in what could be interpreted as an aggressive gesture, every system in her highly trained nervous system activated simultaneously. The first thing that happened was purely mental. Sarah's brain processed Rodriguez's position, posture, and probable next move in the space of a single heartbeat. Standing approximately 4 feet away, right foot forward in a slightly aggressive stance, center of gravity shifted toward his front leg, dominant hand raised and moving in her direction. His left side was exposed, his balance was compromised by his forward lean, and his attention was focused entirely on her face rather than her hands. In the specialized language of close quarters combat, Rodriguez had just presented her with what instructors called a gift target, an opponent who had positioned himself for maximum vulnerability while believing he held the advantage. The second thing that happened was physical. Sarah's body moved without conscious direction from her higher brain functions, operating instead from the muscle memory that had been burned into her nervous system through thousands of hours of training in situations far more dangerous than a military dining hall. Rodriguez's hand was still moving toward her when Sarah stepped forward and slightly to her left, closing the distance between them while moving outside the arc of his intended strike. Her left hand came up in a motion so smooth and economical that most observers would later swear they hadn't seen it move at all. Her palm made contact with Rodriguez's extended wrist, redirecting the force of his motion while destabilizing his balance even further. At the same moment, her right hand shot forward in a precise strike to a pressure point just below his elbow, causing his arm to go temporarily numb and forcing him to lean further forward to compensate. These preparatory moves took approximately half a second and were almost invisible to the crowd of onlookers. What happened next was impossible to miss. Rodriguez, thrown off balance by Sarah's deflection of his arm and the sudden numbness in his right side, instinctively tried to compensate by shifting his weight and bringing his left leg forward in what was probably intended as a kick or a stabilizing step. This was exactly what Sarah had been waiting for. As Rodriguez's left leg came forward, Sarah dropped into a low crouch and swept her right leg in a perfect arc that caught his supporting leg just above the ankle. The technique was called a low leg sweep in most martial arts systems, but in Navy SEAL training it was taught as a combat takedown with limb destruction potential. The difference wasn't just semantic. A traditional leg sweep is designed to take an opponent to the ground. Sarah's version was designed to break bones. Rodriguez's leg was bearing his full body weight when Sarah's sweep made contact. The impact was precisely calculated to create maximum structural stress at the weakest point of his stance. His tibia and fibula, the two bones in his lower leg, were suddenly subjected to forces they were never designed to handle. The sound of bone breaking was clearly audible across the dining hall, a sharp crack that seemed impossibly loud in the suddenly quiet space. Rodriguez's scream followed immediately afterward, a sound of genuine agony that made several observers take involuntary steps backward. But Sarah wasn't finished. As Rodriguez fell toward the ground, his body twisting from the pain of his shattered leg, Sarah rose from her crouch and caught him by his uniform shirt. Her movement was perfectly controlled, designed to manage his fall in a way that would minimize his injury while maximizing the psychological impact on everyone watching. She guided Rodriguez to the ground with the same calm precision she had used to break his leg, lowering him onto his back in a position that kept pressure off his injured limb while ensuring he remained completely helpless. Her knee came to rest lightly on his chest, not applying enough pressure to restrict his breathing, but making it clear that she could do so whenever she chose. The entire sequence from Rodriguez's raised hand to his position flat on his back, with a broken leg, had taken less than 3 seconds. 3 seconds that had transformed him from an aggressive bully to a beaten man writhing in pain on the dining hall floor. The silence that followed was absolute. 500 military personnel, including seasoned combat veterans who had seen action in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other global hotspots, stared in complete shock at what had just transpired. Many of them had never seen violence that was so controlled, so efficient, and so utterly devastating. Sarah remained crouched over Rodriguez for several more seconds, her breathing still completely normal and her expression unchanged from the calm professionalism she had displayed throughout their entire confrontation. She looked down at him with the same detached interest a scientist might show when examining an interesting specimen. "You were saying something about real soldiers, Sergeant?" she asked in a conversational tone, as if they were still engaged in a normal discussion rather than the aftermath of a combat takedown that had left him with a compound fracture. Rodriguez's face was pale with shock and pain, and he was hyperventilating in a way that suggested he might be going into shock. His broken leg was bent at an angle that was clearly visible even to those watching from across the room, and several people were already reaching for their phones to call for medical assistance. Sarah looked up from Rodriguez and scanned the dining hall, making eye contact with various personnel who had been watching the confrontation. Her gaze was steady and unashamed, carrying no trace of regret or concern about what she had just done. "Does anyone else have questions about my qualifications?" she asked, her voice carrying clearly across the silent space. The response was immediate and unanimous. Heads shook, eyes looked away, and several soldiers who had been Rodriguez's most vocal supporters suddenly found urgent reasons to examine their breakfast trays with intense concentration. Major Patricia Williams was the first to break the spell of shocked silence. She approached Sarah's position with her hands clearly visible and her movements slow and non-threatening, recognizing that she was dealing with someone whose combat instincts were now fully activated. "Lieutenant Shun," Major Williams said carefully, "I need you to step away from Sergeant Rodriguez so the medics can treat his injury." Sarah looked up at Major Williams and nodded acknowledgement. She rose smoothly from her position over Rodriguez, stepping back far enough to give medical personnel room to work while remaining close enough to intervene again if Rodriguez somehow found the energy to continue their confrontation. The dining hall erupted into activity as multiple people called for medical assistance, and several nearby personnel rushed forward to help Rodriguez. His injury was severe enough to require immediate evacuation to the base hospital, and within minutes the dining hall was filled with medical technicians and emergency response personnel. Through all of this activity, Sarah remained standing in exactly the same position, watching the proceedings with the same calm attention she had displayed throughout the entire incident. Her hands were relaxed at her sides, her breathing was normal, and her uniform was still perfectly pressed and regulation compliant. Lieutenant Maria Santos pushed through the crowd of onlookers and approached Sarah cautiously. Like Major Williams, she seemed to understand that her roommate was operating in a different mental state than normal and needed to be approached with appropriate caution. "Sarah," Maria said quietly, "are you okay? Are you hurt?" Sarah turned to look at Maria, and for just a moment her professional mask slipped enough to reveal a hint of the person underneath. "I'm fine, Maria. Thank you for asking." "Jesus Christ," Maria whispered, staring at her roommate with a mixture of awe and concern. "What the hell was that? Where did you learn to fight like that?" Before Sarah could answer, Major Williams returned to their position. She had been speaking with the medical team and coordinating with the military police who were beginning to arrive to investigate the incident. "Lieutenant Shun," Major Williams said, "I need to ask you some questions about what just happened here. But first I need to know if you require medical attention or if you have any injuries that need to be addressed." "No, ma'am. I'm uninjured," Sarah replied. Sergeant Rodriguez raised his hand toward me in what appeared to be a threatening gesture, and I responded according to my training. The use of force was proportional to the perceived threat. Major Williams studied Sarah's face carefully, noting the complete absence of defensive posturing or emotional distress that she would have expected from someone who had just been involved in a violent altercation. "Lieutenant, I've been a soldier for 22 years, and I've never seen anyone neutralize a threat that efficiently. I'm going to need you to explain exactly what kind of training prepared you to do what I just witnessed." Sarah glanced around the dining hall, noting the crowd of observers who were still staring at her with expressions that ranged from shock to admiration to fear. The Pentagon evaluators who had been eating breakfast at the officers' table were now speaking urgently into their phones, and she realized that word of this incident was going to reach very high levels of the military hierarchy very quickly. "Ma'am, I believe that information falls under classification restrictions that prevent me from discussing it in an open setting," Sarah said. "I would be happy to brief you privately on any aspects of my background that are relevant to this incident." Major Williams nodded slowly, beginning to understand that Lieutenant Sarah Chun was not at all what she appeared to be. The calm professionalism, the precise language, the complete lack of emotional reaction to having just broken another soldier's leg. These were the characteristics of someone with extensive combat experience and specialized training. "All right, Lieutenant. Report to my office at 1,300 hours for a full debriefing. Until then, you're restricted to base pending investigation of this incident." "Understood, ma'am." As the medical team loaded Rodriguez onto a stretcher and prepared to transport him to the hospital, he managed to turn his head towards Sarah one last time. His face was twisted with pain and medication-induced confusion, but his eyes held a new understanding of exactly who he had been harassing for the past several weeks. "Navy SEAL," Sarah said quietly, confirming what Rodriguez had probably already figured out. "I tried to tell you, Sergeant. You chose not to listen." Rodriguez's mouth moved as if he wanted to say something, but the medics were already wheeling him toward the exit. As the stretcher passed through the dining hall doors, the absolute silence that had gripped the room since the confrontation began finally started to break down into whispered conversations and shocked exclamations. Sarah stood in the center of it all, still radiating the same calm professionalism that had characterized her entire time at Fort Braxton. But now everyone understood that her quietness had nothing to do with weakness or passivity. She was quiet because people with her level of training didn't need to make noise to be dangerous. The story of what had happened in the dining hall would spread throughout Fort Braxton within hours, and throughout the wider military community within days. But for now, in this moment, Sarah Chun was simply a Navy SEAL who had finally been forced to reveal her true nature to protect herself from a threat. The element of surprise that had been her greatest weapon was now gone forever, but she had used it one final time to devastating effect. Rodriguez had wanted to know what kind of soldier she really was, and now he had his answer in the form of a broken leg and a lesson in respect that he would remember for the rest of his career. The investigation that followed the dining hall incident would prove to be unlike anything Fort Braxton had ever experienced. Within 6 hours of Rodriguez being transported to the base hospital, personnel from the Naval Special Warfare Command, the Department of Defense Inspector General's office, and the Pentagon's Joint Staff had descended on the installation like a bureaucratic avalanche. Major Patricia Williams found herself at the center of a classification nightmare that threatened to expose operational security protocols she hadn't even known existed. The simple task of writing an incident report had become an exercise in navigating redacted personnel files, security clearances that required special handling, and a chain of command that suddenly included admirals and generals she had never heard of. Sarah spent the morning after the incident in a secure conference room, participating in a series of phone calls with her actual superiors in the Navy SEAL community. The cover story that had protected her identity for months was now completely blown, and her commanders needed to decide whether to extract her from Fort Braxton or adapt her mission to accommodate her new public status. Lieutenant Chun, came the voice of Rear Admiral Catherine Morrison through the encrypted phone connection. I need you to walk me through exactly what happened yesterday morning. Start from the beginning and don't leave out any details. Sarah had already provided this account 3 times to different levels of her chain of command, but she understood that each briefing served a different purpose in the military's decision-making process. Admiral Morrison was the commanding officer of Naval Special Warfare Group 3, and her questions would focus on operational security rather than disciplinary action. Ma'am, Sergeant Rodriguez had been creating a hostile work environment for approximately 6 weeks through verbal harassment and intimidation tactics. Yesterday morning, his behavior escalated to the point where he made physical contact with my person in what could be reasonably interpreted as an assault. Define physical contact, Lieutenant. He raised his hand toward me in an aggressive manner while making verbal threats. Based on his positioning, body language, and stated intentions, I assessed him as presenting an immediate threat to my safety. And your response? I neutralized the threat using minimal necessary force, ma'am. One leg sweep resulting in a fracture to his left tibia and fibula. The engagement lasted approximately 3 seconds from initiation to resolution. Admiral Morrison was quiet for several moments, and Sarah could hear papers shuffling in the background. Lieutenant, you understand that this incident has created complications far beyond the immediate disciplinary issues. Your cover as a communication specialist is now completely compromised, and your presence at Fort Braxton is going to raise questions about why we had a SEAL operator embedded in a joint task force without informing the other service branches. Yes, ma'am, I understand the operational security implications. More importantly, you understand that video footage of this incident is already circulating through social media channels. Someone in that dining hall had a phone recording, and the footage shows you taking down a soldier who outweighs you by at least 80 pounds in less time than it takes most people to blink. This was news to Sarah, and she felt a familiar tightness in her stomach that always accompanied operational security breaches. Ma'am, how wide is the distribution of this footage? Wide enough that we're getting calls from reporters, defense contractors, and foreign intelligence services who want to know more about American female special operations capabilities. The cat is not just out of the bag, Lieutenant. The cat is on YouTube with 3 million views and counting. Sarah closed her eyes and tried to process the implications of what Admiral Morrison was telling her. The careful balance between operational security and gender integration in special operations had been one of the most sensitive issues facing the military for the past decade. Her incident with Rodriguez had just thrust that entire debate into the public spotlight in the most dramatic way possible. "What are my orders, ma'am?" "For now, you're to remain at Fort Braxton and cooperate fully with all investigations. But, Lieutenant, I want you to understand that this situation is going to get much bigger before it gets smaller. You've just become the public face of women in special operations, whether you wanted that responsibility or not." The call ended with Sarah feeling more exposed and vulnerable than she had during any of her combat deployments. In Afghanistan and Iraq, she had been part of a team with clear objectives and established protocols for handling threats. Now she was navigating a political and media landscape that was far more complex and dangerous than any battlefield. Meanwhile, in the base hospital, Sergeant Rodriguez was discovering that his problems extended far beyond a broken leg. The orthopedic surgeon who had repaired his fracture informed him that he would need at least 6 months of physical therapy before he could return to full duty, and there was no guarantee that he would ever regain complete mobility in his left leg. More immediately concerning was the investigation being conducted by the military police. Rodriguez had initially assumed that he would be treated as the victim of an unprovoked assault, but the dozens of witnesses to their confrontation had provided a very different version of events. Captain Robert Hayes from the Fort Braxton Military Police had interviewed more than 50 personnel who had been in the dining hall during the incident, and their accounts painted a consistent picture of Rodriguez as the aggressor who had been escalating a pattern of harassment over several weeks. "Sergeant Rodriguez," Captain Hayes said during their second interview, "I need you to help me understand why you thought it was appropriate to raise your hand toward Lieutenant Shun in a threatening manner." Rodriguez, still groggy from pain medication and the shock of his injury, struggled to reconstruct the sequence of events that had led to his downfall. "I wasn't threatening her, sir. I was just trying to make a point about military discipline and respect for rank structure. By raising your hand toward a superior officer while making verbal threats about what happens when someone messes with a real soldier. That's your idea of military discipline." "She was disrespecting the uniform, sir. The Navy sent us some diversity hire who thinks she can play soldier with real combat veterans. I was trying to put her in her place." Captain Hayes studied Rodriguez with the expression of someone who was rapidly losing patience with his explanation. "Sergeant, are you aware that Lieutenant Shun is a Navy SEAL with multiple combat deployments and specialized training in unconventional warfare?" Rodriguez stared at Captain Hayes as if he had just announced that Lieutenant Shun was secretly an alien from another planet. "That's impossible, sir. She's a communications specialist. It says so right in her personnel file. Her cover file, Sergeant. Lieutenant Shun was operating under classification restrictions that prevented disclosure of her real background. You've been harassing one of the most highly trained soldiers in the entire U.S. military while assuming she was just a desk clerk." The revelation hit Rodriguez like a physical blow. Every interaction he had had with Sarah over the past 6 weeks suddenly took on a completely different meaning. Her calm responses to his provocations, her detailed knowledge of tactical procedures, her complete lack of intimidation in the face of his aggressive behavior. It all made sense now. "Sir," Rodriguez said weakly, "I had no way of knowing her real background. If someone had told me she was special operations, would it have mattered, Sergeant? Would you have treated Lieutenant Shun with more respect if you had known she was a SEAL? Or should you have treated her with respect because she's a fellow service member and a superior officer?" Rodriguez didn't have an answer for that question, and Captain Hayes didn't wait for one. The investigation was already revealing a pattern of behavior that went far beyond a single incident in the dining hall. Multiple female personnel had come forward with complaints about Rodriguez's conduct, and his own soldiers were describing a leadership style that relied heavily on intimidation and harassment. Back in Major Williams' office, Sarah was learning that her personal situation was about to become significantly more complicated. The Pentagon evaluators who had witnessed the incident were recommending a complete review of gender integration policies in special operations, using Sarah's case as a primary example. Lieutenant Shun, Major Williams said, reviewing a stack of reports and directives that had arrived throughout the morning, "I need you to understand that you're about to become the subject of intense scrutiny from Congress, the media, and every advocacy group on both sides of the Women in Combat debate." Ma'am, I never sought that kind of attention. I was simply doing my job and defending myself when threatened. I know that. And frankly, that's what makes this situation so problematic for your critics. You didn't ask to become a symbol. You didn't seek out confrontation. And you handled the threat against you with exactly the kind of professional competence that the military wants from all its personnel. Sarah shifted in her chair, uncomfortable with the direction the conversation was taking. Ma'am, what does that mean for my future assignments? That's being decided at levels far above my pay grade, Lieutenant. But I can tell you that your days of operating undercover are probably over. The question now is whether the Navy decides to use your public exposure as an opportunity to showcase the success of women in special operations, or whether they try to minimize the attention by transferring you to a less visible assignment. Major Williams paused and studied Sarah's face carefully. Can I ask you a personal question, Lieutenant? Of course, ma'am. Do you regret what happened in the dining hall? If you could go back and handle the situation differently, would you? Sarah considered the question for a long moment before responding. Ma'am, I regret that Sergeant Rodriguez forced me to reveal my background in such a public manner. I regret that he was injured, even though his injury was a direct result of his own actions. But I don't regret defending myself when threatened, and I don't regret demonstrating that underestimating someone based on their appearance can have serious consequences. Even knowing that your response is going to make you the center of a national debate about women in the military. Ma'am, that debate was going to happen eventually whether I was involved or not. The integration of women into special operations is a reality that the military is still learning to handle. If my situation helps accelerate that learning process, then perhaps some good can come from an otherwise unfortunate incident. Major Williams nodded, impressed by Sarah's perspective on the larger implications of her situation. Lieutenant, I want you to know that in my professional opinion, you handled yourself exactly as any properly trained soldier should have when faced with a threat. The fact that you're a woman, the fact that Sergeant Rodriguez underestimated you, and the fact that he was seriously injured as a result of his own poor judgment, none of that changes the fundamental reality that you defended yourself appropriately. Thank you, ma'am. I appreciate your support. You're going to need all the support you can get, Lieutenant. This story is going to follow you for the rest of your career, and you're going to find yourself either celebrated as a pioneer or criticized as a political symbol, depending on who's doing the talking. As Sarah left Major Williams' office to return to her quarters, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the space of a single morning. For months, she had been able to serve quietly and effectively while maintaining the anonymity that made her most useful to her commanders. Now, she was about to become the most famous female special operations soldier in American military history, whether she wanted that distinction or not. The challenge would be learning to navigate her new public role while maintaining the professional effectiveness that had made her successful in the first place. Rodriguez's mistake hadn't just cost him a broken leg and potential disciplinary action. He had inadvertently created a case study in gender integration that would be analyzed and debated for years to come. And Sarah Chun, the quiet communications specialist who had never wanted to be the center of attention, was about to discover what it meant to be a reluctant symbol in one of the most contentious debates in modern military history. 3 months after the incident in the Fort Braxton dining hall, Sarah Chun found herself standing in the Pentagon briefing room, facing a panel of senior military officials who would determine the future direction of her career and, by extension, the role of women in special operations. The YouTube video of her takedown of Sergeant Rodriguez had indeed reached millions of views, sparking congressional hearings, editorial debates in major newspapers, and passionate discussions on social media platforms around the world. The 3-second encounter had become a symbol for both supporters and critics of gender integration in combat roles. Sarah had spent the intervening months in a strange limbo, temporarily assigned to the Pentagon while various investigations concluded and policy decisions were made. She had testified before classified congressional committees, participated in military review boards, and endured countless interviews with investigators trying to understand the implications of her case. The panel facing her now included Admiral Morrison, her SEAL commander, along with representatives from each branch of service and several civilian officials from the Department of Defense. Their decision would affect not just her individual career, but potentially the careers of every woman currently serving or aspiring to serve in special operations roles. Lieutenant Shun, said General Patricia Blackwood, the Army's representative on the panel, we've reviewed all the documentation related to your incident at Fort Braxton, and we need to address several issues that have emerged from our investigation. Sarah sat at attention, her uniform perfectly pressed and her bearing reflecting the same calm professionalism that had characterized her throughout this entire ordeal. Yes, ma'am. First, the investigation has concluded that your use of force was completely justified and proportional to the threat you faced. Sergeant Rodriguez's behavior was inappropriate, unprofessional, and ultimately dangerous. His actions created the confrontation that led to his injury. This conclusion had taken months to reach, as investigators had painstakingly interviewed hundreds of witnesses and reviewed security footage from multiple angles. The final report had been unambiguous in its conclusion that Rodriguez had been the aggressor and that Sarah had responded appropriately to a legitimate threat. Second, continued General Blackwood, the investigation revealed systemic issues with harassment and discrimination at Fort Braxton that extended far beyond your individual case. Sergeant Rodriguez's behavior was part of a pattern that affected multiple female personnel and created a hostile work environment that was detrimental to mission effectiveness. Rodriguez himself had been court-martialed and discharged from the Army with a reduction in rank and loss of benefits. His injury had healed poorly, leaving him with a permanent limp that would serve as a daily reminder of the consequences of his poor judgment. Several other soldiers who had participated in the harassment campaign had received various forms of disciplinary action. Third, Admiral Morrison added, your case has forced the military to confront some uncomfortable realities about the integration of women into special operations. The fact that you were able to serve effectively while your true qualifications remained classified demonstrates both the success of our training programs and the persistence of gender bias in military culture. Sarah had become an unwitting test case for a debate that had been raging within military circles for years. Her ability to perform her duties while being consistently underestimated by her male colleagues had highlighted the gap between official policy and practical implementation of gender integration. Lieutenant Shun, said Dr. Margaret Foster, a civilian analyst from the Defense Department, we need to discuss your future role in the military. Your public profile makes it impossible for you to return to covert operations, but your experience and expertise make you too valuable to waste on routine assignments. This was the conversation Sarah had been dreading. Her effectiveness as a special operations soldier had always depended on her ability to blend into different environments and avoid attention. That capability was now permanently compromised by her newfound fame. Ma'am, I understand the limitations created by my public exposure. I'm prepared to accept whatever assignment best serves the needs of the Navy and the broader military community. We've identified several options for your consideration, Admiral Morrison said, opening a folder that contains Sarah's potential future assignments. The first option is a training role at the Naval Special Warfare Center, where you would be responsible for developing and implementing training protocols for female candidates in the SEAL program. The idea of becoming an instructor had appeal for Sarah, as it would allow her to use her experience to help other women navigate the challenges of special operations training. But she also understood that such a role would further cement her status as a symbol rather than an operator. The second option, continued Admiral Morrison, is a liaison position with Congress and the Department of Defense, where you would provide expert testimony on gender integration issues and help shape policy development for women in combat roles. This option held less appeal for Sarah, as it would essentially transform her from a soldier into a political figure. While she understood the importance of the policy work, it represented a fundamental departure from the type of service she had envisioned when she first enlisted. The third option, said General Blackwood, is a hybrid role where you would divide your time between operational assignments and public advocacy. You would continue to serve in special operations capacities while also representing the military in public forums and educational settings. Sarah considered each option carefully before responding. May I ask what recommendation the panel is prepared to make? Dr. Foster smiled slightly. Lieutenant, after reviewing your service record and the circumstances of your current situation, we believe the hybrid role offers the best balance between utilizing your operational skills and addressing the broader institutional needs highlighted by your case. However, Admiral Morrison added, we want you to understand that accepting this role means accepting permanent status as a public figure. You'll be speaking at military academies, participating in media interviews, and serving as a visible representative of women in special operations. It's a very different kind of service from what you originally signed up for. Sarah had spent weeks thinking about this exact scenario, and she had come to terms with the reality that her career would never again resemble the anonymous service she had originally preferred. The question was whether she could find meaning and purpose in this new role while maintaining her effectiveness as a soldier. I accept the hybrid assignment, Sarah said after a long pause. But I have one request. What's that, Lieutenant? I want to continue active operational deployments as part of my duties. I don't want to become just a spokesperson or a symbol. I want to remain a functional special operations soldier who also happens to have public responsibilities. The panel exchanged glances, and Sarah could see them weighing the operational security implications of her request against the benefits of keeping her actively engaged in military operations. That can be arranged, Admiral Morrison said finally. Though you understand that your operational assignments will need to be carefully selected to minimize security risks while maximizing the training and mentorship opportunities for other personnel. 6 months later, Sarah found herself standing before an audience of 200 female midshipmen at the Naval Academy, delivering a speech about leadership, perseverance, and the importance of maintaining professional standards regardless of the challenges faced. The young women in the audience represented the future of the military, and Sarah could see in their faces the same determination and ambition that had driven her own career. Some of them would undoubtedly face situations similar to what she had experienced with Rodriguez, and her story had become part of their preparation for those challenges. The most important lesson I learned from my experience at Fort Braxton, Sarah told the audience, is that competence and professionalism are the best responses to discrimination and harassment. You cannot control how others choose to treat you, but you can control how you respond to that treatment. After her speech, during the question and answer session, a young midshipman asked the question that Sarah had been expecting. Ma'am, do you regret breaking Sergeant Rodriguez's leg? Sarah paused for a moment, considering her response carefully. I regret that Sergeant Rodriguez forced me into a situation where violence was necessary. I regret that he was injured, even though his injury was a direct result of his own poor choices. But I don't regret defending myself when threatened, and I don't regret demonstrating that underestimating someone based on their appearance can have serious consequences. The midshipman nodded, apparently satisfied with the answer, and Sarah could see understanding in the faces of many other young women in the audience. They were learning that strength came in many forms, and that the quiet professionalism that had characterized Sarah's approach to military service was often more effective than loud displays of aggression. Rodriguez, meanwhile, had faded into relative obscurity following his discharge from the Army. His attempt to capitalize on his notoriety by writing a book about his experience had failed when publishers discovered that his version of events contradicted the testimony of hundreds of witnesses and the findings of multiple investigations. He had found work as a security guard at a shopping mall, a position that allowed him to wear a uniform and exercise limited authority over civilians who were required to respect his position regardless of their personal opinions about his competence. It was a far cry from his military career, but it represented the best opportunity available to someone whose poor judgment had cost him both his profession and his reputation. The broader impact of Sarah's case continued to ripple through military culture in ways both large and small. Training programs began incorporating specific modules on gender bias and harassment prevention. Personnel policies were updated to provide better protections for service members operating undercover. And slowly, gradually, the culture began to shift toward a more inclusive understanding of what military excellence looked like. Sarah's hybrid role proved to be more challenging and more rewarding than she had initially expected. Her operational assignments allowed her to continue developing her skills and serving in meaningful ways, while her public responsibilities gave her the opportunity to influence policy and inspire the next generation of military leaders. She had never wanted to be a symbol or a spokesperson, but she had learned to embrace the responsibility that came with her unique position. Her story had become larger than her individual experience, representing the ongoing evolution of American military culture and the gradual recognition that excellence in service came in many different forms. The 3 seconds in the Fort Braxton dining hall had changed everything about Sarah's career and her life, but they had also contributed to changes that would benefit countless other service members for years to come. Sometimes the most important battles were fought not on distant battlefields, but in everyday situations where courage meant standing up for principles, even when doing so came at personal cost. Rodriguez had learned the hard way that assumptions about other people's capabilities could be dangerous. Sarah had learned that sometimes the most important service you could provide was simply being yourself, even when that meant giving up the anonymity and quiet effectiveness that had originally attracted you to military service. The woman who had once been content to serve in the shadows had become a beacon for others, proving that true strength often came from the most unexpected sources and that the ability to remain calm under pressure was one of the most powerful weapons in any soldier's arsenal.